Now we're going to start adding some custom logic with react.js. If you don't have a lot of experience with React, don't worry too much. I'll try to explain as best as possible. Another thing that you need to look out for is I always recommend you to check out the documentation for anything we work on. We are using Framer, so be sure to check out the Framer API for any information related to creating custom components or even adding any custom logic. The information will all be here in the framer.com/API. Be sure you don't get it confused with Framer Motion. Framer Motion is the web-based animation library. And then the Framer library is regarding to if you were to install Framer or if you were just to use the Framer web application. Now to write custom code, we'll switch over to this code tab in the top left, and we can create a new code file. We'll call this file header.tsx. And now since we aren't creating any new components because we already designed certain components, we'll want to create a new override, which allows you to override any custom logic that may already be present. And it's going to give us some boilerplate that we can use to our advantage. We are using TypeScript also, so just make sure you write header.tsx and not header.js or header.jsx. You don't need to use TypeScript, it's definitely optional, but it allows for type checking, which can help validate or make sure you're writing correct types. So to break this down real quick, let me zoom in just so that we can see what's going on. We've got app state, and what app state's representing is just a generic state. So right now what we're tracking is the amount of taps we may have clicked. Looking at these functions, we've got tap frame, rotate frame, and text element. And so what these are doing, first they're returning some styles. So we've got border radius, and then we've got a while tap property, which while tap is pretty much not the full click, but once we've clicked before we've let go of the mouse, while tap will scale down. And then the on tap property is running a function which will update the app state taps to a +1. So right now it's 0, and depending on how many times we tap on this tap frame component, it's going to update the state by 1. So if we continue tapping, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. Rotate frame, all it's doing is running this animate property, which will rotate this rotate frame, depending on what we define, by 90 degrees. And then text element, if we select text element and display it on the screen, it's going to return the amount of taps that are in our state. So this is honestly a perfect example on how we can use these functions in our current app. So let's close this and we'll select content. This is just an example. Let's just say that we wanted to tap on this design system file preview. We can select this overrides plus and then select a file. We're going to reference the header.tsx, this header file. And then the override, we've got these three functions that I've already talked about. The tap frame, which updates the state and also scales it down. Then the rotate frame, which rotates the component, and then text element, which returns the amount of times we've clicked on the state. Now I'll go ahead and select tap frame. And what tap frame is going to do is update the state as well as scale it to 0.9 like it mentioned. We can select the scroll artboard so that we can preview here. And if I select design system, it should update the state and also show a click animation which scales down the background. So as I'm clicking, you can see that it is scaling the back. But to see the current state, we can use that text element. We can change this design system, select overrides, and then select header, and then the override is going to be text element. So you can see text element is currently 0 in our preview. And every time we click, it updates to however many times we've clicked on our item. Let me select the scroll artboard so that we could preview the entire thing. And you can see as we tap, it's updating the state. So it's just custom logic that isn't built in Framer, but we can use code to pretty much update the state, which is really neat. Now I'm going to undo everything we did. That was just kind of showing you how we can use the overrides. And to remove it, we can just click new file and now it's gone. We could do the exact same for our design system here. We can click new file and it will return back to design system. So now we're ready to write our own custom logic. We can head back to code and select header.tsx and then change this to where we can create our animation for our scroll. Now we want to track two things. Now for our app state, we don't care about taps, and frankly, we don't care about anything. So we can get rid of all of these custom functions. And what we're going to update app state to is the following. Since we don't care about taps, we want to track two things. We want to track when we have scrolled to a certain section, and we'll return a Boolean if it's true or false to execute certain commands. So I will call this top header animate, and we'll set it to false initially because it's not going to be true. And then we'll create an additional property and we'll call this bottom header animate. Okay, so what this is going to be is that team view, and then this page title is going to represent bottom header. So what these represents is top header represents that team view, and then bottom header animate represents the page title, which is that recent files plus those icons. Next, we need to figure out a way to track the scroll position. To do that, we can create a variable and call it scroll y. And now scroll y needs a value. So initially it's always going to be 0. To use values in Framework Web, we'll need to use motion values, and we'll set the default motion value to 0. Now it's going to give you an error because we cannot find motion value, and that's because we haven't imported motion value. Be sure to import motion value from Framer, and we should be good to go here. We could add some comments just so that we can define what we're doing. Scroll y is simply going to track the scroll amount or the scroll position. We can just say track scroll amount. And like I mentioned, the default is going to be 0, or the initial is going to be 0. Next, we need to create a custom override for our scroll. To do that, we'll create a custom function. So we'll export function scroll, and scroll is going to be an override for that scroll component that we already are using. What we're returning here is the following. The content offset y is going to be equal to the scroll y. So we'll add some comments and we'll say custom offset correlated to the scroll y, which again is going to be the initial of 0, but this is going to update as we scroll. So right now the preview will work just as is because we haven't assigned any of the custom functions just yet. What we also need to do is figure out a way how we can change false to true had we scrolled down enough. So the idea here is that the top header animates right here. Once we've scrolled down around 40 to 60 pixels, we want it to go up and fade out. And then once we scroll down enough, we want to change the size of this recent files and then make it stick to the top. So I'm thinking once the motion value has hit about 40 pixels, which is around here, we will then set the state to true, allowing us to execute certain animations or certain logic to get these to behave differently. What we can do that is write scroll y.onChange. And inside this onChange function, we're going to pass in offset and then run a function which will check the following. So if appstate.topHeaderAnimate is the following, so if offset is less than 40 pixels. So the idea here is once we've reached 40 pixels or scrolled down 40 pixels, we will then update the top header animate to true. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the bottom header animate, so we can copy and paste this and then switch the top header animate to bottom header animate. And we could change the values here. For now, I'll leave it as 40 pixels just to test it out. So the idea here is once this is true, we're going to update the app state top header animate to true. Right now it's at false, but then again, that's because the offset is currently at 0. So now let's actually build a header container that will be fixed at certain points and also change the height. What we can do is export function, and we can call this header container. And this is going to be an override. So what we're doing here is we'll create a new variable and call it header y, which this is going to track the y position of our header. And we'll use a use transform. And what use transform does is it allows us to create a motion value that transforms the output of another motion value. So the idea here is we're going to pass whatever the value of scroll y is. So we'll write scroll y. And then if you've used Framer Motion in the past, you do know that they work with ranges. So we're going to have an initial and an end. Now what I'll pass is an array, which will define the initial, which is 0, and then wherever we want to end the following or stop the animation, which right now our scroll y is set to 0 at the top. And then once we've scrolled a certain amount, I'm thinking once we've scrolled past like 400 pixels, that's when we want the header to stop being fixed. Now the next array we are passing is defining where the position of our header is going to be. So initially it'll be set to 0. And then since we've set negative 400 pixels of the scroll y, depending on where we're scrolling, we're going to set the top of our header to a total of 400, which is just going to be the opposite of wherever our scroll y is set to. Now I am getting an error because we did not import use transform. So let's do that. Import use transform at the top. And for some reason, I did add a semicolon instead of an equal sign, which just be sure to fix that real quick. Now we do need to return something here, right? So I'll set a return, and what we're returning is the following. So y is going to be set to whatever header y is equal to. Now let's save this and see if we're on the right track. It will autosave, so we can hit close. And we've already built two functions. The first one is a scroll function. So if we select this scroll, we can create an override, select the file of header. And then for the override, we'll give it a scroll override. And then for our header container, we can select this header container and then select an override, select the file of header. And then for the override, we'll select header container. Now, if I start scrolling, what should happen is that the header container should make each element fixed, which it does. Now you can see that it is overlapping, and I think that's because for our header container here, we need to make sure that it's just layered on top of everything else. So let's look for this header component and then layer it on top of all the other content. Select the scroll again, and then now as we scroll down, you can see that it is in fact fixed, just like we want it to be fixed. Okay, perfect. We can then work on shrinking the height. So as we scroll down, we're going to shrink the height and get rid of this team yellow and then shrink the size of recent files. Let's go back into the code tab, open up header tsx, and then we'll create a new variable and we'll call this height, y. Now this will be very similar to what we did before with the use transform. We'll pass in the scroll y, and now we're setting ranges. So here, once we've passed, I want to say 56 pixels, what we're going to do is update the following. We're going to change the current height of whatever our header container is from 136 pixels to 56 pixels. So this does a better job of explaining. Right now, scroll y is set to 0. So once scroll y gets past negative 56 pixels, it will change the height of our header container from 136 pixels to 56 pixels. We can return this like so. Just to make sure we're updating the right property, we'll write height, and then we'll pass in height y. So now if we preview real quick, if we start scrolling, you can see that the height is changing for our header container, which is also changing the recent file's position, and it does that automatically. To get this to show a bit better, what I'm going to do is just change the header container background. I'll set it to this blue color and I'll lower down the opacity a bit. If we jump back into code, so now you can see that the motion value of scroll y is set to 0, meaning the height is 136 pixels. As we start scrolling down, it's going to decrease the height all the way until it reaches 56 pixels, which is equal to the negative 56 pixels in terms of its position. So once we start scrolling down here, we need to go back to layers and then make sure you select scroll so that it could preview scroll. Go to code, and then now when we start scrolling down, it will start updating the height up until it reaches negative 56 pixels, and it stops updating the height and it will be set to 56 pixels. Now I could change this, right? I could make the header grow larger as we're scrolling down. All this is going to do is just push the header to a larger height until we've reached negative 56 pixels for our scroll y, which is our position, and then it will be stuck on 400 pixels. So now we can just scroll up and down like so. Okay, so it's pretty neat, and I do like this whole ranges thing. I think it's really cool. We're going to set this back to 56 pixels because that's what we want it to be once we start scrolling, and I think it's an appropriate height to where it doesn't bother the users as they're scrolling through. So one thing we haven't been able to test is in fact if the header is going to go away after 400 pixels. And that's because I believe the content isn't long enough and we never reached 300 or 400 pixels. Maybe if we decrease this down to 200 and then decrease the position down to 200, we'll then have enough room to scroll all the way until negative 200, and then it will stop being fixed. So as we're scrolling down and scrolling down some more, you can see that once we pass that 200 mark of our motion value or of our scroll y, it will stop setting the position of the top to 200 pixels, meaning that the header will go away. So this is pretty typical on a lot of applications, right? As the user is scrolling down and scrolling further and further, we don't necessarily need to display the header anymore. And then when the user scrolls back up, it will show back up. All right, cool. So we've gotten that and we're getting a better grasp of writing code and understanding how these different functions are used within Framer. What I'll go ahead and do is go back to the layers and I'll hit Control Z or Command Z to get rid of that opacity and that color of our background. We'll go back into code, and what we've got now is that header changing, and it all looks great except the fact that we need to change the size of our recent files, and we need this team yellow to fade up and go away. Now I'll pick up the pace a little because it takes a while to fully understand how Framer works. At first it might be a little confusing, but as you continue along, I'm pretty certain that you will like it. Next, we're going to work on this team header section. What I'll go ahead and do is create an export function, and we'll call it team header. And now team header is going to be an override because we've already defined the component or designed the component. And in here, we're not going to define anything initially, we're just going to return certain logic. I didn't spell override correctly, so make sure you do that. Now in our return statement, here's what we're going to say. We're going to have an initial, which the initial will be set to an opacity of 1. Now if you've used Framer Motion before, you do know that in Framer Motion, to define certain animations, there is like an animate property, a initial, and an exit property if you're running animations on a component on mount. But here it's sort of similar where we have initial, animate, exit. We won't use exit because we're not unmounting anything, but we'll use animate. So we want animate to run only when we've scrolled down to 40 pixels. And here is where we use a ternary operator, which will check if the state is true, and if it is, we will execute a certain animation. We'll write app state dot top header animate, and then we'll use a question mark as our ternary operator, and if it is true, we'll set the opacity to 0. Otherwise, we're setting the opacity back to 1. Don't forget to add a comma here after the initial curly bracket. So to test this out, what we'll do is jump back into our layers. We'll select the team header. We'll write an override, select the file of header, and for the override, we want it to be the team header override. Select scroll so that we could preview, and then let's go back into our code. So now what should happen is as I scroll down, the team yellow should fade out. And it does. So once our motion value is hit -40 pixels, it is then going to set the state to true, allowing us to set the opacity to 0. This is where this scroll Y on change top header animate function comes in handy. Again, I can edit this to where it's 20. So now when I've scrolled down 20 pixels, it's going to run this animation early on. Right now, let's go ahead and start scrolling. And you can see that it runs really early. And then really you could just play with this to determine what is the best position that you want these certain elements to fade out or fade in. So to explain it one more time, we've got a state which contains top header animate. Top header animate is initially false. What we're doing is we're making it true once we've passed -20 pixels. And this might be a little confusing, but when you scroll down, it goes in a negative number. And when you scroll up, it's a positive number. So as we're scrolling down, once we've hit -20 pixels, it is then updating this top header animate to true. And once it's true, this animate property will then run opacity 0. Since it is false right now, opacity is always going to be set to 1. I can also get rid of initial here if I want. It's really up to you. Since we've already defined the opacity in the design, it doesn't really matter to update it because the initial is already set to an opacity of 1. And we don't need to just write it again. You can write it if you want, it's all up to you. I'll go ahead and remove it since we don't need it. We can also add transitions, and in the transition property, we can define easing. So I can say ease in out, and I could also give it a duration of 0.3. This will allow us to create some easing effects, and we can also add delays and everything in the transition. Definitely check out the API for more information about it. So once we've scrolled down enough, we'll hide that, and then this will be fixed. And then once we pass 200, it will go away. So it's starting to come along now, so let's carry on. The next function we're going to do is a shrink. And what this is going to be is it's going to shrink the text. So we'll say shrink, and shrink is going to be an override. And what we're returning is the following. We'll say animate app state dot, and we'll target the bottom header animate. If this is true, we'll scale down to 0.7. Otherwise, we'll set the scale back to what it is, which is 1. Now I'm getting an error because we forgot to add a semicolon after the parentheses. Let's test this out. Go to layers, and what we're changing is this recent file text. So I'll select recent file and create an override. We'll select header, and then we'll say shrink. So let's actually test and see if this is working. As we scroll down, we want the text to shrink, but it isn't shrinking. And that's fine. I think that's because we aren't allowed to scale text. What we could do instead is the following. We can select recent files, we can add a frame, and from here we can then scale frames, which will ultimately scale the text. So select recent file text layer, and we can add new file, getting rid of the override, but then select the recent file frame, which right now is just called frame. What we can do is call this page title. Selecting page title, adding an override of file header, and then we can say shrink. So let's test this out now. As we scroll down, you can see that the recent file does shrink, but it isn't aligned to the left. And we can fix that here in a second. Okay, perfect. So you can see that it's shrinking down. Okay, cool. Let's go to the code. And for some reason, 2 files have been made, app.tsx and app1.tsx. I don't know what those are. So if they were made on your end, also go ahead and delete them. We don't need it. Now, I did say we want to fix the left align. And what we could do is create the following. So initial, and what we're passing here is a transform origin, and we'll set left. So we're letting the text file or that layer know that it's going to be a transform origin of left. Now let's go ahead and see. Perfect. So now it's scaling down like we wanted to. Awesome. I wonder if there's a way to add a bit of easing when it comes to the use transforms. I know that in Framer Motion, there's like a use spring. So we might want to look at that in the future. Because right now, sometimes when you're going way too fast, it will override it. What we can also do to make this a bit better is that instead of having these team header kind of stay in one place and then overlap each other, we can select both team header and the page title, and we can add a frame. And then now, since they are grouped together, the following will happen. And as we start to scroll, you can see that team header scrolls up with the recent files and then fades out. So we lose that issue of needing to overlap each other. We can even go fast and we don't see a problem. Okay, perfect. So again, as we're scrolling down, team yellow reaches at -20, it fades away. Recent files reaches at -40 position for the motion value, it shrinks. And then once we reach 56 pixels, it sticks in place, which becomes fixed. And then once we scroll down to -200, that's when it changes the position and it stays in one place and we lose that header. So we've gotten that complete. Last thing we're doing is if we select search goodies, we're going to we're going to magic motion the following screen. So right now it's a bit iffy, right? So let's actually slow it down to see what happens. If we select this and select the focus, specifically the transition, we have a spring animation. Let's switch it to easing and let's make it 1 second so that we can actually kind of break it down rather than it being really quick. If we select search for goodies, so you saw that, right? Recent searches was today. And if we refresh and look at it again, selecting search for goodies, so you can see what happens there, and it's a lot slower. Today, which is right here, becomes recent searches, and then the search for goodies input goes up and changes size. So there's a better way of doing this. If we look at recent searches here, we don't want it to be from today. And to fix that, we can select recent searches and then we can add it inside of this stack area. So if we select recent, let's layer it on top. Let's select recent and stack and create a frame. This frame will be called history. And now history is going to contain recent and the stack. Let's go ahead and hit fit content just in case. Selecting history, let's add a background to it, which is going to be that background color. And then we can select history and paste it into the content area. Make sure it has a fill, which is going to be the background. I don't know why I didn't copy that, but we'll bring this down to be under the search for goodies, and we can provide it a margin of 20 pixels, and we'll fade it out. So now let's try this out one more time. If we select the scroll artboard, select search for goodies, you can see that that's just a lot cleaner in my opinion, and it doesn't have any overlapping issues. Let's refresh and try that one more time. Okay, perfect. So I don't like the fact that recent searches is growing, and I wonder what is causing that, because it's not changing here, right? So let's try something. Let's click on today, and I'm trying to figure out if there's like anything I can do here in terms of like changing a ID or something, or just changing the names. Yeah, I don't really know why it might be doing that. What if we change recent searches to say hello instead? And then if we select this again. Okay, so that fixed it. Changing the name, which is a bit weird because recent searches doesn't exist in today. Today and recent searches have completely different names, but I guess I'm missing something, or it's a bit buggy, which is fine. Now, if we select the cancel key, what we want to do is we want to go back to the initial artboard. So we can have the cancel key, and if we select L, it won't link it because it is a text layer, but adding a frame should do that. So go ahead and add frame, and we can call this frame cancel button. So this cancel button will now take us back to the frame. Hitting L on the keyboard, you can go back here. And then if we select transition, what we can do is for our target, we can say back to previous also, or we could just select the artboard. Let's set back to previous, which will take us back to whatever that transition was. Let's click on the scroll artboard. And if we select search for goodies, it does that animation. Selecting cancel will bring everything back. Now, of course, we can change the easing so that it isn't as slow. We'll select 0.3, and we could leave ease in, ease out. Selecting search for goodies now takes us here. Clicking it takes us back. All right, so that's gonna do it here. We've built the UI, we've added custom code for prototypes, and we've also added magic motion to take us between two different screens. If you did enjoy this and do want me to continue this series, let me know down in the comments below. Don't forget to like. If we do continue the series, we'll build out the bookmark section as well as the settings tab, and we'll continue to build out this entire application. That's gonna do it for me. Have a wonderful day.